Welcome back to this third segment of this law session in relation to electoral law. Now, before the break, we considered different types of political systems. As I said to you in the last segment, the idea is that questions can be on this particular aspect or that particular aspect. And the point that you have to consider, of course, is whether or not the first past the post with its ease and simplicity at the expense of representation or proportional representation is a better option, or would it be that you get something better when, for example, you may have to wait a little bit for the result, but proportionally people feel more involved? Might this be a criticism that the reason people don't feel part of the whole electoral system and why there's low voter turnout is that people don't think it will make a difference? Whereas if you give them an alternative choice, that may be the case. Again, it is a matter that you may want to consider. The other aspect, of course, that you need to consider in the context of electoral law is political party funding. And that, of course, means how persons can make donations in respect of a political party. We've seen the general elections in the UK before. We've seen the US elections. We hear about the extraordinary amount of monies that have been used. And when you go back even to the Barack Obama and the George Bush political campaigns, you can see just the extraordinary amount of monies that were spent there, and even in the election with Romney, again, extraordinary amounts of monies. But is it that all these things ought to just carry on unchecked? Well, the idea of political funding in the UK has been a source of much controversy for many years. There are three main ways that a political party is funded. The first is, of course, through membership subscription. So if you are a member of the Conservative Party, you would pay your subscriptions. The second, of course, is through donations. And for opposition members, the third is through state funding, though only for their administrative costs. Now, until 2000, the UK had one of the world's least regulated political financing regimes. And it was extraordinary because when you look at it from this kind of country who is supposed to arguably know better and do the right thing, it has been dogged. Political party donation has been dogged with not only controversy, but this taint of corruption and the whole discussion, especially to do with, cash for peerages, meaning that people would make donations to a political party, and if they got into power, then they would make this donor a lord or something. That kind of leaves a nasty taste in the mouth as well. And there's the whole situation with Bernie Ecclestone, which is the Formula One boss, of course, and that created some storm. The idea being that it needed reform. It needed to be reviewed, not least because, especially coming out of the 97 election, there were a lot of sour grapes, as it were. People were not happy with the way immediately after you had certain persons coming into peerages and the like. And of course, calls for reform and draft legislation has been on the parliamentary agenda from the time of the 1970s. But it has really come into its own in 2000 or thereabouts. So we see that by and large, there was this idea of reform from about the 70s with the Housen Committee, and the Home Affairs Select Committee in the 1990s also advanced some kind of changes. And we see the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which was led by Lord Nolan, also making suggestions, and certainly Lord Neil. Now, a series of critical press stories which suggested that the exercise of political influence in favor of rich individuals added to pressure to reform the system. And as I say, you did have persons who would be extraordinarily large donors to both parties. And then miraculously, once that party was in power, it ended up with these persons getting some kind of political favor, not least being given a seat possibly in the House. Now, the result of all of this reform and pressure was the PPERA in 2000. Now, the legal position before 2000 was that party funding was very lightly regulated before the PPERA. There were and continue to be several laws which had some bearing on political finance, but it really didn't have that kind of teeth. So when, for example, you looked at the 1983 Act, which dealt with corrupt and illegal practices, then you had the Corrupt and Illegal Practices Prevention Act of 1883, and it broadly sought to reduce the impact of money and the scope for bribery when you look at elections and money is being given. It places restriction on expenditure by candidates, and it provided the basis for the law as we know it now. There was also the Honors Prevention of Abuses Act in 1925, which made it an offense to grant or obtain an honor in exchange for cash or other benefit, and was introduced following the sale of honors when Prime Minister Lord George was in office. There's also the Representation of the People's Act of 1983, which placed limits on spending by or on behalf of individual candidates for office. And of course, the Companies Act of 1985 requires companies to disclose donations which they make in excess of a specified amount. The Trade Union and Labor Relations Consolidated Act 1992 also allows trade union members to contract out of subscribing to political funds. But the fact is that change was needed because donations were open to abuse, it was open to corruption. The case for states funding has been made that maybe it should not be so much on the basis of individual donations, rather it should be for the state to put some sort of funding forward. Now, you could consider, for example, the USA, because there is some state funding framework in place, and it appears the candidates can contract out of that. Now, the arguments and those favoring state funding in Britain have suggested that it would have some sort of great beneficial impact on the current political atmosphere and also on the perception of politicians and also corruption, because with state funding of parties, there could be no financial scandals or issues of buying off governments with donations. Now, the Bernie Ecclestone affair damaged the Labour Party, and this, of course, is the sort of situation which would suggest that if there was public funding or state funding, this would not be the state of affairs. Now, with public funding, that £1 million donation would arguably have been unnecessary and would not have caused the problems that it did. Now, the current reliance on big donors would be, of course, severed, and with that, of course, this whole substantial voter perception that politicians are corrupt would also go. Now, a system which involves state funding is one which is employed in the USA and Germany, by which the state will match private donations. This means that the donor, in giving to their chosen party, knows that their money will be partially or wholly matched by the state. The party will be encouraged to really go out on funding drives and hopefully increase public awareness about politics at the same time, while knowing that they will, of course, benefit from the money given, which the state will match. Now, there are also arguments against state funding. One of the major ones, of course, is in relation to the perception of the citizen over funding parties which she or he may not actually agree with. So the fact is that if anything says state, it means you and I. So if it is that X gives money to party A and the state has to then match that money is coming from you or I, which means, do I want to donate to that? Well, the idea of contribution to a party with ideals that are not my ideals has been suggested, an idea which the average voter may very well find unacceptable. Now, you could hardly see, for example, members of ethnic minorities being happy about, say, funding the campaign of the British National Party, for instance. But the fact of the matter is, if it comes in for one party, it has to come in for all. It can't be selective. So the idea is that if a party is going to raise funds from its donors, then the state will fund it. And of course, that argument would not necessarily wash with some voters. Now, those who are also against state funding also suggest that, contrary to those in favor of a system of state funding, could in fact make it more difficult to break into the British political system, particularly if funding was decided on the party's performance at the last election. So, if you're going to put in a framework of state funding, what is the status? What is the basis for the allocation of funds? Well, the belief is that while the current major parties will still have significant funds, the smaller ones could be squeezed out of the system, because if it is that the way that funds are allocated is relative to how a party did in a previous elections, or, God forbid, the number of voters or persons on the electoral roll registered as being a voter for a particular party, it may very well be that, let's say, the Labour Party gets 1 million in donations and the state gives 1 million, but a smaller party, let's say the Green Party, only gets 100,000. Well, their matching funds is 100,000. The problem, of course, is that does it bode not so well for smaller parties? Well, pressure for change has existed, as I say, in the form of parliamentary committees in the years leading up to the PPRA, but they were not completely successful in effecting reform. So when you look at the Housen Committee in 1975, there was a majority recommended in that committee recommended that public funding be tied to a party's share of the vote at previous general elections in recognition of the rise in costs and fall in membership of parties. They proposed a limit of 20% of income from the state. Now, the Hansard Society in 1981, there was a report noting that the heavy dependence on narrow sources of funding was against the public interest because it distorted electoral choice and it militated against participation. It gave great privileges to interest group and disadvantaged smaller parties. That was the view there. Now, in 1994, with the Home Affairs Select Committee report, this committee was split along party lines with the casting vote to the Conservative chair. It suggested little change was appropriate in British circumstances, but it did call for the adoption of a code of practice to make clear to donors that money did not buy influence. Now, the thing is that they consider that we did not need to change it. The idea was that you just had to make sure that persons did not expect they were getting something. Now, in the Labour Party manifesto of 97, this featured a commitment to require disclosure of sources of larger donations and to ban foreign donations and to ask the Committee on Standards in Public Life to review party funding. Well, the Neil Committee, which a lot of the current proposals tend to go back to, not all of it, of course, was taken on board, but in the Neil Committee, this report was in response to the government's request, which called for the establishment of an electoral commission, reporting of donations, a ban on foreign donations, shareholder approval of company donations, and modest funding for policy development. Now, the Neil report looked in great detail at this whole issue and decided to recommend certain proposals. Now, the committee suggested that there should be tax relief on donations up to £500, which would encourage individual members to donate and take part in the political process outside voting. Now, another recommendation of the committee was to match funds in relation to the number of party members. It should be remembered, of course, that between 1946 and 1951, the Conservative raised their membership from somewhere between 250,000 to 2.8 million, and in that process raised over £10 million in small amounts. Now, this would encourage parties to increase their membership and, of course, get people directly involved. That's the idea anyway, is so that with this increased membership, the idea is that small groups would, of course, make these donations. However, the government accepted most of these, with the notable exception of tax relief on donations. The Electoral Commission's annual report, as we see in 2007-2008, revealed that in 2007, the Labour Party received 20.4 million in donations and the Conservative Party 21 million, Lib Dems only 3.2. Now, the concern continues to surround donations to political parties from overseas donors who have companies registered in the UK, and at the moment such donations are lawful provided they comply with the Act. What we will do now, of course, is take a short break, and as we come back into the next segment, we will consider the Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act of 2000 and what it provides for.